June 19, 1944, 30,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore checked his fuel gauge, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and counted the Japanese aircraft filling his windscreen. 23 Zeros, flying in a loose formation that stretched across 3 miles of empty sky, heading straight for the American fleet below. 23 against 4. His wingmen were good pilots, young, brave, trained as well as anyone could be trained in 18 months of war, but they were flying F6F Hellcats, the fighter that every hotshot in the Pacific had dismissed as a flying truck. Too heavy, too slow, too unglamorous compared to the sleek Corsairs and the legendary Zeros they faced. The Japanese pilots in those Zeros had been flying since Manchuria, since China, since Pearl Harbor. They had hundreds of hours of combat experience. They moved through the sky like dancers, their aircraft responding to the lightest touch, capable of maneuvers that would tear an American plane apart. James had heard all the arguments. He had listened to the experts explain why the Hellcat was a compromise, a stopgap, a fighter designed by committee for pilots who could not handle real aircraft. He had watched younger pilots request transfers to Corsair squadrons, embarrassed to be seen in the Grumman Ironworks product that everyone called the Beast. But James knew something those experts did not understand. He knew it in his bones, in his hands. In the thousands of hours he had spent studying how aircraft actually performed in combat rather than on paper. The Hellcat was not fast. It was not agile. It was not beautiful. It was a killer. And in the next 12 minutes, James Whitmore was going to prove it. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the massive Pratt & Whitney engine respond with a roar that shook his entire airframe, and dove toward the Japanese formation with 3 wingmen behind him, 4 slow, ugly American fighters against 23 of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. The odds were impossible. The mathematics of aerial combat said they should die, but mathematics had never met Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from the Pacific War that reveal what happened when courage met impossible odds, when one pilot's unconventional thinking changed everything. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. James Whitmore was born in 1914 in the industrial city of Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the factories never stopped humming and the air always smelled of machine oil and progress. His father worked at the Sikorsky aircraft plant, assembling the flying boats that would revolutionize aviation, and James grew up surrounded by the magic of flight. The Sikorsky factory was a cathedral of engineering, a vast space filled with the sounds of riveting and welding, where men transformed sheets of aluminum and coils of wire into machines that defied gravity. James spent his childhood wandering those aisles, watching the flying boats take shape, asking questions that the workers answered with patience and pride. But James did not dream of being a pilot. He dreamed of being the man who made pilots possible. From the age of 12, he spent every spare moment at his father's factory, learning how aircraft were built from the inside out. He understood the stress tolerances of aluminum skin, the harmonics of propeller blades, the 1,000 small compromises that transformed blueprints into machines that could actually fly. He learned that every aircraft was a conversation between possibility and limitation, between what designers dreamed and what physics allowed. By the time he was 16, the engineers at Sikorsky were asking his opinion on assembly problems. By 18, he could diagnose engine trouble by sound alone, distinguish between a healthy power plant and one that was days from failure. His father wanted him to become an engineer, to follow the respectable path through college and into the drafting rooms where the real work happened. But James had other ideas. In 1936, at the age of 22, he enlisted in the Navy and requested assignment to flight training. The decision baffled everyone who knew him. James was not the typical pilot candidate, not the athletic golden boy, not the natural daredevil, not the young man who had dreamed of the sky since childhood. He was quiet, methodical, more comfortable with a wrench than a stick. His instructors at Pensacola noted his technical excellence, but questioned his aggression, his willingness to take the risks that combat flying demanded. James graduated in the middle of his class, unremarkable in every way that the Navy measured pilots. He was assigned to a patrol squadron flying PBY Catalinas, the slow, unglamorous flying boats that searched for submarines and rescued downed airmen. It was not a prestigious assignment. It was not the path to glory. But it was exactly what James needed. Flying the PBY taught him patience. It taught him to read the ocean and the sky, to understand weather patterns and fuel consumption, to think in terms of hours rather than minutes. The slow, steady rhythm of patrol flying gave him time to think, time to observe, time to develop the analytical habits that would later save his life. Most importantly, it taught him that survival in aviation was not about speed or agility. It was about understanding your aircraft's true capabilities and using them correctly. When war came in December 1941, James was 37 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He requested transfer to a combat squadron and was politely refused. The Navy needed experienced patrol pilots more than it needed another middle-aged man trying to prove something in a cockpit. James accepted the decision without complaint. He flew his patrols, searched for Japanese submarines, rescued survivors from torpedoed ships. He did his duty, but he also watched and learned, studying the reports that came back from the carrier battles, analyzing the tactics that worked and the mistakes that killed. The Zero mystique fascinated him. The Japanese fighter had achieved an almost supernatural reputation in the first months of the war, faster, more maneuverable, more deadly than anything the Americans could put in the air. Pilots who survived encounters with Zeros described them as impossible to hit, impossible to escape. Flown by men who seemed to merge with their machines, stories circulated through the fleet about Zero pilots who could perform maneuvers that violated the laws of physics, who could appear out of nowhere and vanish before their victims knew they were under attack. The fear was real and it spread through American squadrons like a disease, making men hesitate at exactly the moments when hesitation meant death. But James, with his mechanic's eye, saw something different in the reports. He saw an aircraft that sacrificed everything for performance: armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural strength. He saw pilots who relied on agility because they had nothing else. He saw a tactical doctrine built on the assumption that the enemy would always try to match the Zero's strengths rather than exploit its weaknesses. And he began to develop a theory. In 1943, the Navy finally relented and allowed James to transfer to fighters. He was 39 years old, the oldest pilot in his training class by more than a decade, surrounded by young men who could not understand why this quiet, gray-haired lieutenant wanted to fly combat missions when he could have sat out the war in safety. James did not explain. He simply trained. The aircraft he was assigned to learn was the F6F Hellcat, Grumman's new carrier fighter. The Hellcat had entered service in 1943 as the Navy's answer to the Zero, but it was an answer that puzzled many pilots who first encountered it. The Hellcat was not fast. Its maximum speed of 380 miles per hour was barely competitive with the Zero and significantly slower than the Army's P-51 Mustang or even the Navy's own F-4U Corsair. It was not agile. The Hellcat's turning radius was wider than the Zero's, its roll rate slower, its climb rate inferior at most altitudes. It was not beautiful. Where the Zero was sleek and elegant, a predator designed by artists, the Hellcat was barrel-shaped and brutish, a flying bathtub powered by the largest engine Grumman could fit into the airframe. Its lines were functional rather than graceful. Its proportions dictated by the demands of carrier operations rather than aerodynamic ideals. The young pilots complained constantly. They wanted Corsairs with their distinctive gull wings and superior speed. They wanted P-38 Lightnings with their twin engines and glamorous reputation. Anything but the ugly Hellcat, the fighter that seemed designed to be adequate at everything and excellent at nothing. James listened to the complaints and said nothing, but he was studying the Hellcat with the same intensity he had once studied factory blueprints, learning every capability and limitation of the aircraft he would take into combat. What he discovered surprised him and confirmed his theory about how to fight the Zero. The Hellcat was heavy because it was armored. 200 pounds of steel plate protected the pilot from behind, designed to stop the bullets and shell fragments that killed pilots in unprotected cockpits. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, made with layers of rubber that would close around bullet holes, designed to survive hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. The Hellcat's weight meant it could dive faster than any Japanese fighter, building speed in a descent that the lightly built Zero could not match without tearing itself apart. Its massive engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the most powerful aircraft engine in the world, produced enough power to accelerate out of trouble even when loaded with ammunition and fuel. Most importantly, the Hellcat was rugged. It could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and keep flying. It could make hard landings on pitching carrier decks. It could be repaired with standard tools by mechanics who did not need special training. James understood, in a way that the younger pilots did not, that these were not weaknesses. They were design choices made by engineers who understood what carrier warfare actually required. The Hellcat was not built to win dogfights. It was built to win wars. And James had figured out exactly how to use it. By early 1944, James had been promoted to lieutenant commander and given command of a fighter division aboard the carrier USS Lexington. His pilots were young, eager, and deeply skeptical of both their aircraft and their commanding officer. James did not try to change their minds through argument. He changed them through demonstration. In training exercises, he showed his pilots something that contradicted everything they had been taught about aerial combat. He showed them that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide, but that refusing to dogfight was victory. The theory was simple, built on principles that any engineer would recognize. The Zero's advantages, speed, maneuverability, climb rate, all depended on staying in a turning fight, where the lighter aircraft could use its agility to get on the enemy's tail. This was the dogfight of legend, the circling dance of predators that aviation mythology celebrated. But the Zero had critical weaknesses that its reputation obscured. It was fragile. A few hits from the Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns would tear it apart. Its engine could not sustain high-speed dives. Its pilot, unprotected by armor, was vulnerable to even glancing hits. James taught his pilots to fight like nothing the Japanese had ever seen. Attack from above, using the Hellcat's superior diving speed. Make one pass, guns blazing. Then keep diving, using the heavy fighter's momentum to escape before the Zero could respond. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never turn. Never slow down. Never give the Zero the fight it wanted. The tactics resembled nothing that pilots had been taught. Traditional aerial combat emphasized pursuit, closing with the enemy, achieving firing position through superior maneuvering. James was asking his men to abandon all of that, to fight in a way that felt like running away. The young pilots resisted at first. The tactics felt cowardly, hit and run rather than stand and fight. They had been trained to pursue, to close, to kill. James was asking them to run away after every attack, but in training exercises, the results spoke for themselves. Pilots who followed James's tactics scored simulated kills at ratios that seemed impossible. Pilots who tried to dogfight were declared dead within minutes. Slowly, the skepticism faded. The pilots began to trust their commander's strange methods, even if they did not fully understand them, and James began to prepare them for the battle he knew was coming. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were massing their remaining carrier strength for a decisive confrontation. The Imperial Navy had lost hundreds of experienced pilots over the previous 2 years, but they still had aircraft, still had carriers, still had the will to fight. When the American fleet moved to support the invasion of the Mariana Islands, the Japanese would respond with everything they had left. James studied the reports with the same analytical intensity he had once applied to aircraft blueprints. He calculated fuel ranges, flight times, intercept angles. He tried to imagine what the Japanese commanders were thinking, what tactics they would employ, what mistakes they might make. And he realized something that changed everything. The Japanese pilots were not the same men who had dominated the skies in 1942. The veterans were mostly dead, killed in the grinding attrition of 2 years of island warfare. The pilots who remained were younger, less experienced, rushed through training programs that could not replace years of combat wisdom. The Zero was still dangerous. A single mistake, a single moment of turning to fight, and the Japanese pilot's superior agility would become lethal. But the men flying it were no longer supernatural. They were human, fallible, and vulnerable to tactics they had never encountered. James gathered his pilots in the ready room the night before the battle and explained what he expected. They would face superior numbers. They would be outnumbered and outmaneuvered. But if they followed his tactics, if they trusted the Hellcats' strengths and refused to play the Zero's game, they would survive. More than that, they would win. The young pilots listened with expressions that mixed fear and determination. None of them fully believed it was possible, but they believed in their commander. And on June 19, 1944, they flew into the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese attack came in waves. 4 massive strikes launched from 9 carriers sent more than 400 aircraft toward the American fleet. It was the largest aerial assault since Pearl Harbor, a desperate gamble to destroy the American carriers and turn the tide of the war. The Japanese commanders had staked everything on this operation, believing that one decisive victory could still change the outcome of a conflict that was slipping away from them. James and his division were part of the fighter screen protecting Task Force 58. They had launched at dawn and climbed to 30,000 feet, orbiting above the fleet, waiting for the radar controllers to vector them toward the incoming threat. The call came at 1,000 hours. Bogies, bearing 270, distance 80 miles. Many bogies. James acknowledged the vector and turned his division west, toward the rising sun and the Japanese formation that was already visible as a dark smear against the morning sky. As they closed the distance, the smear resolved into individual aircraft, Zeros mostly, with a few torpedo bombers and dive bombers mixed in. He counted quickly. 23 fighters in the group he was assigned to intercept. His division had 4 aircraft. The mathematics were terrible. But mathematics had never accounted for tactics. James keyed his radio and gave the order that his pilots had trained for. Remember the drill. Diving pass. Don't turn. Rejoin at Angels 25. Let's go. He rolled his Hellcat onto its back and pulled into a screaming dive, the massive Pratt & Whitney engine howling as airspeed built past 400 miles per hour. Behind him, his 3 wingmen followed, 4 American fighters plunging toward 23 Japanese aircraft, like hawks stooping on sparrows. The Zeros saw them coming. The Japanese formation began to scatter, pilots instinctively turning to meet the attack, trying to bring their guns to bear on the diving Americans. But James had calculated this moment. At 400 miles per hour, the Hellcat was closing the distance faster than the Zero pilots could react. By the time they completed their turns, the Americans were already through the formation. James picked his target, a Zero slightly separated from the others, its pilot still trying to understand what was happening, and opened fire. The 650 caliber guns roared together, pouring over 100 rounds per second into the Japanese fighter. Tracers reached across the sky like lines of fire. The Zero disintegrated, its fragile airframe torn apart by the weight of American metal. 1 second. 1 kill. James kept diving, resisting the overwhelming urge to pull up and re-engage. The Zeros were turning behind him, trying to pursue, but the Hellcat's dive had built too much speed. The Japanese fighters fell behind, their lighter airframes unable to match the Americans' momentum. At 15,000 feet, James pulled out of his dive and began to climb, scanning the sky for his wingmen. 3 Hellcats were reforming on his wing. All had survived the pass. One reported a probable kill. Another had missed completely, his guns jamming at the critical moment. But they were alive, and the Japanese formation was in chaos. James led his division back to altitude and repeated the attack, diving past, guns blazing, then away, refusing to engage in the turning fight that the Zeros wanted. The second pass killed 2 more Japanese aircraft. The third pass killed another. Each time the Zeros tried to pursue, tried to draw the Americans into a dogfight, tried to use their superior agility to turn the tables. Each time the Hellcats refused, diving away and climbing back to altitude for another pass. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, 8 Zeros were falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. The remaining 15 had scattered, their formation broken, their attack on the American fleet disrupted. and James Whitmore's division had not lost a single aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the most one-sided carrier engagement in history. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk by American submarines and aircraft. The Imperial Navy's aviation arm, which had terrorized the Pacific for 3 years, which had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor and conquered half an ocean, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Japanese would never again be able to challenge American naval power in the air. The war would continue for another year, but its outcome was now certain. The mathematics had changed forever. James Whitmore's division accounted for 11 confirmed kills over 2 days of fighting. James himself was credited with 4 Zeros destroyed and 2 probables. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real victory was tactical. James's methods, the diving attacks, the refusal to dogfight, the disciplined use of the Hellcat's strengths, had been adopted across the fleet. Pilot after pilot reported using the same techniques, with the same devastating results. The Zero's mystique, built over 3 years of combat, was shattered in a single afternoon. After the battle, James was summoned to the flagship for debriefing. Admirals and intelligence officers wanted to understand how a handful of Hellcats had achieved such lopsided results. They expected to hear about superior marksmanship, exceptional courage, individual heroics. Instead, James talked about engineering. He stood before the assembled officers with diagrams he had drawn himself, explaining concepts that seemed obvious to him, but had apparently never occurred to the men who planned aerial operations. He explained the Hellcat's design philosophy, the conscious trade-offs that sacrificed speed for survivability, agility for firepower. He described the Zero's weaknesses, the lack of armor, the fragile airframe, the engine that could not sustain high-speed pursuit. He outlined his tactical doctrine, built on months of analysis and training, designed to exploit every advantage the American fighter possessed. The officers listened with varying degrees of comprehension. Some understood immediately and began thinking about how to apply the lessons to future operations. Others remained skeptical, convinced that the victory was a fluke that could not be repeated. But the results spoke for themselves. In the months following the Philippine Sea, American fighters achieved kill ratios of 13-1 against Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat, once dismissed as a flying truck, became the most successful naval fighter in American history. And the tactics that James Whitmore had developed, tactics that seemed cowardly and unglamorous, became standard doctrine for carrier aviation. James did not seek credit for what he had helped accomplish. He did not write articles or give interviews or campaign for recognition. He was not that kind of man. He returned to his squadron, continued training his pilots, continued flying missions over the shrinking Japanese empire as American forces island-hopped toward the home islands. But something had changed in him. The victory at the Philippine Sea had validated everything he believed about aircraft design and aerial combat, but it had also shown him the human cost of being right. The Japanese pilots he had killed were men, young men mostly, rushed into cockpits with inadequate training, sent to fight in aircraft that were already obsolete against pilots who had figured out how to exploit every weakness. They had been brave, they had been skilled, and they had died because their commanders had not adapted to the realities of 1944 warfare. James thought about them sometimes, late at night in his cabin, listening to the sounds of the carrier and the sea. He wondered if any of them had been mechanics' sons, men who understood aircraft the way he understood them. He wondered if they had realized in those final moments that the war had passed them by. He did not feel guilt exactly. The Japanese had started the war, had committed atrocities across Asia, had forced America into a conflict it had not wanted. Killing them was necessary, but necessity did not make it easy to carry. The war ended in August 1945. James Whitmore was 41 years old, one of the oldest combat pilots in the Navy, with 17 confirmed kills and a reputation that had grown far beyond his modest self-assessment. He was offered promotions, staff positions, a career path that would lead to admiral's stars and a comfortable retirement. He declined them all. The war was over, his work was done, and he was tired in a way that rank and recognition could not heal. He had spent 4 years watching young men die, some of them enemy pilots he had killed himself, and he wanted nothing more than to return to the world of machines, where problems had solutions and the cost of being wrong was measured in metal rather than blood. He returned to Connecticut in September 1945 to the industrial city where he had grown up watching aircraft take shape on factory floors. The war had changed Bridgeport, as it had changed everywhere. Factories that had run 3 shifts for 4 years were finally slowing down, and veterans were returning to a world that had moved on without them. The Sikorsky plant was still running, building helicopters now instead of flying boats, and James found work there as a consultant, using his combat experience to advise engineers on what pilots actually needed. It was quiet work, anonymous work, exactly what he wanted after years of noise and death. He married in 1947 a woman named Catherine who had lost her first husband at Midway and understood what James carried without needing him to explain. They bought a small house near the factory, raised 2 daughters who grew up knowing their father as a quiet engineer, not as the pilot who had helped break the back of Japanese naval aviation. James did not speak about the war. When his daughters asked about his medals, he deflected with vague generalities about flying and ships and the Pacific. When they asked about the war itself, he changed the subject to homework or weather or anything else. The kills, the tactics, the 12 minutes over the Philippine Sea when everything had come together. These remained locked inside him, shared only with Catherine in rare moments when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. The Hellcat faded from memory as new jets replaced the propeller fighters of the war years. The F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-14 Tomcat, each generation of Navy fighters built on lessons that James had helped teach, though his name was never mentioned in the manuals. The tactics James had pioneered became so standard that their revolutionary nature was forgotten. Young pilots learned his methods without knowing his name, the way young engineers use formulas without knowing who derived them, the way doctors use treatments without knowing who discovered them. James accepted this anonymity without complaint. He had never wanted fame. He had wanted to survive, to bring his pilots home, to prove that the ugly fighter everyone mocked was exactly what the Navy needed. All of these things had happened. What else was there to want? What else could a man ask for, except to have made a difference in the lives of others? In 1967, a historian researching carrier aviation in World War II tracked James down at his home in Bridgeport. The historian had found references to James's tactical innovations in Navy archives and wanted to record an interview for a documentary about the Pacific War. James agreed reluctantly. Catherine had died 2 years earlier, and the loneliness of the empty house had begun to weigh on him. The rooms that had once been filled with her presence now echoed with silence. Perhaps talking about the past would help. Perhaps it would not. Either way, it seemed time to let someone else carry the story. The interview lasted 4 hours. James spoke slowly and precisely, describing the Hellcats' design, the tactical theory he had developed, the engagement over the Philippine Sea when everything had been tested. He did not dramatize or exaggerate. He simply explained the way he might explain an engineering problem to a colleague. At the end of the interview, the historian asked the question that everyone eventually asked: how did it feel to shoot down 17 enemy aircraft? James was quiet for a long moment. He stared out the window at the autumn sky, the same pale blue he had seen from 30,000 feet over the Pacific, a lifetime ago. It felt necessary, he said finally. I did not enjoy it, I did not hate them, I understood them, I think. They were doing what they had been trained to do. So was I. The difference was that my training was better suited to the circumstances. That is not a moral judgment, it is just engineering. The historian did not fully understand. James did not expect him to. He died in 1978, at the age of 64, from a heart condition that the Navy doctors said might have been caused by the stress of combat flying decades earlier. His daughters buried him next to Catherine in a cemetery overlooking Long Island Sound, where the aircraft from the Sikorsky factory still flew overhead on test flights, their rotors beating the air the way propellers once had. The headstone listed his name, his dates, and his rank. It did not mention the kills. It did not mention the tactics. It did not mention the 12 minutes that had helped change the course of the Pacific War. James would have wanted it that way. The work mattered more than the name attached to it. But his granddaughter, a young woman named Elizabeth, who had inherited his mechanical aptitude and his quiet way of solving problems, found his flight logbooks while sorting through his papers after the funeral. She found the notes he had kept during the war, the diagrams of attack angles, the careful calculations of fuel consumption and dive speeds. She found letters from pilots he had trained, thanking him for lessons that had saved their lives, letters that James had never mentioned to anyone, that he had kept in a box at the back of his closet for 30 years. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that her quiet grandfather had been something extraordinary. Not a hero in the conventional sense. He would have rejected that word with his usual quiet modesty. But something more interesting. A man who had looked at a problem that everyone else found impossible and seen a solution that was hidden in plain sight. A man who had understood that the tools themselves were not the limitation. The limitation was in how people thought about using them. They had mocked his aircraft. They had called it slow and ugly and unworthy of real fighter pilots. They had said it could never match the legendary Zero, never defeat the Japanese pilots who had ruled the Pacific skies. And then they had watched him sweep 23 Japanese fighters clean out of the sky, not through courage alone, though courage was there, but through the cold application of engineering principles that turned weakness into strength, that made the Hellcats' weight into armor and its power into escape. That is what the sky remembers about Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore. That is what we should remember too, that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who watch and learn and think while others laugh, are the ones who see the truth that everyone else has missed. And when the moment comes to prove it, they do not hesitate. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most and tell us where you are watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together we ensure that the wisdom of those who saw what others could not see is never forgotten, never lost to the passage of time and the fading of memory. The men who mocked the F6F Hellcat were not fools. They judged aircraft the way everyone judged aircraft, by speed and agility and beauty, by the metrics that Aviation magazines celebrated and ace pilots boasted about. But James Whitmore judged aircraft like an engineer, by what they could actually do in the conditions that actually mattered, not in test flights over California, but in combat over the Pacific, with lives hanging on every decision. And when those conditions arrived, 30,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, with 23 Zeros filling the sky and the fate of the American fleet hanging in the balance, James proved what he had always known. That victory belongs not to the fastest or the most agile, but to those who understand their tools well enough to use them correctly. 4 slow, ugly Hellcats against 23 legendary Zeros. The experts said it was impossible. The mathematics said they should die. But mathematics had never met Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore. The sky still remembers. And now so do you.